Hey there, everybody. Today we are going to do something completely different, and I'm going to do a narrated bike ride slash watercolor session. A lot of you guys know that I've been getting into watercolors. There have been some requests for a Bob Ross style video. This is going to be it. We'll see if this works. But first off, I'm going to talk a little bit about the bike and the bag. I'm riding the Velo Orange Polyvalent, and typically I have a basket on it, but I removed it because I'm currently testing this Bags by Bird saddlebag. So this bag is designed by Jay Ritchie. You may know him as the filmmaker behind El Silencio. We first met him when he used to work at Rivendell, and currently he is, aside from making films, he's also come out with his own bag line. This is a new product that he hasn't formally announced yet, but it's basically kind of a smaller version of his current bags. It's designed to fit around, or it's designed to fit between 44 and 46 millimeter handlebars. So not quite as wide as those ridiculous Ultra Romance bars, but more reasonable sizes. So it's sitting between these Velo Orange gravel bars, and you can see the basic attachment. Instead of using leather toe straps or Velcro, his design uses volet straps. Those are those bright green things. Coming up to this little bumpy climb here, and it's actually fairly steep. You can't really tell with the GoPro; it kind of distorts it a little bit. But the bike, worked its way over, and this bag is actually surprisingly stable. It doesn't flop around. I think the volet straps do a good job at holding the bike in place, and I used a bungee cord on the bottom to kind of lash it to this rando rack. Here's another fun bumpy section. So some of you might be wondering where I'm riding. We live here in Missoula, Montana, and the area actually has a fair amount of trails that's pretty accessible from downtown, from where we live. So I'm taking just a pretty mellow trail section that leads to the Rattlesnake Rec area, where a lot of people go trail running, do longer mountain bike rides, and all that stuff. It's right now it's super hot in Missoula, so it's also one of the few places to ride where there's always trees and you're not as exposed. So I decided today, shot this morning, to test out this bag, shoot some B-roll, but to load it up with some watercolor stuff. And speaking of watercolor, I have arrived at my destination. This gives you a sense of how the bag opens, and we'll get to see some of my watercolor gear here. So first off, that bag is a Rivendell Sackville bag. It's got the paints and everything, a little folding tripod stool, and of course a sketchbook. This is the Pentalic Aqua Journal. It works pretty well. Set the bike down here. Now to set up my little tripod stool here. This was actually a pretty sweet buy. It folds down really small. It's fairly lightweight. It's sturdy. It's a little tricky to assemble. There are some techniques to put it together a little bit quicker. But what I love about it is that it's not very expensive. I think I bought it for about $20. I'll look it up and put it in the link in the description below, so if you want to pick it up. Definitely a luxury item for bike packing. I usually take it with me when I go painting, throw it in the backpack, or here on the bike. It actually fits pretty well in the handlebar bag. I'm struggling a little bit putting it together because I haven't been using it that much. But there it is. That's a trick. You got to lean into it with your body, and boom, you got a chair. All right, let's get drawing. Okay, so this is what I paint with. That is a Holbein watercolor palette made in Japan. Very difficult to find. I actually found it at a art store in Vermont. My little water thing with a rare earth magnet. Whoops, slipped out. Typically, it'll hold on to the palette fairly well. And I got this cool little brush holder that has a very small selection of brushes and a Blackwing pencil, of course. If you're in the makeup painting, you got to use the most artisanal pencil you can find. This is the gray version. If you're a Blackwing fan, it's a little bit stiffer than the black version, so not as soft, doesn't dull as easily, but not as hard as the white version. So right in the middle, my favorite of the Blackwing pencils. So I've decided to do a sketch of just this road here that goes through the rattlesnake recreation area. It's referred to as the main corridor. So this road goes into the Snake, as it's locally called, for about 14 miles until you hit a wilderness boundary. And at that point, you have to ditch the bike. You can go further. You can hike up to some alpine lakes and stuff, but you can't bike there. Here, I'm just trying to figure out the composition. I think I adjust the camera a little bit better here. Yeah, so for watercolor, I like to do a really rough and simple pencil sketch. It's really just kind of like a hint of the scene. When I first started, my pencil drawings were a lot more detailed, but as I've, just focused on painting more, the pencils are really more just kind of a rough guide of like the big shapes, helps me delineate a little bit where the light and the dark is. So fairly simple. There I'm marking out where the shadow is that's being cast by that tree, and then putting, just drawing where the tree trunks in the foreground will be. So again, just super light. I think here, again, a little bit more of an indication for me where to place the shadows. Nothing like super final, I'm really a big fan of the looser style of painting and drawing. So everything here is just kind of a reminder or a cliff note before I get into the actual paint. Okay, so I've finished the really simple pencil sketch, getting the paints working. You can see me opening up the Holbein, and the water is not moving because there is a magnet at the bottom of that cup, and it keeps it attached to the steel palette. That white is an enamel covering, which is nice because the pigment of the paints tend to not stick unless you use a really strong tinting strength watercolor, but generally it'll remain white. So the brush I'm using is this squirrel hair brush by, I believe it's Da Vinci. And the advantage of that kind of brush is that it soaks up a lot of water, so it's good for covering a lot of area. You can't see the colors I'm mixing, but it's ultramarine and I think like a hooker's green. And I'm making a pretty weak mix of it. If you're not familiar with watercolor, it's typically done in washes, so stages of paint that get progressively thicker and darker. And this is the first wash. So the goal here is to kind of cover up all the white, establish your lightest colors in the scene. So for this scene, I'm painting in where the distant trees would be. In reality, they're actually a lot more vibrant and green and yellow, but for the sake of this painting, I want to push them back further in the scene. So I'm painting them with very low contrast, cooler colors, so more blue, so it kind of recedes into the background, kind of emulates the atmospheric effect of air and color. Here I'm just putting a warm tone on the road. It's kind of I believe this is yellow ochre, a little bit of blue makes a nice neutral warm gray, adding a little bit more warmth in the foreground, and then taking it away apparently. So typically, in painting, the closer you are to the subject, the more it is in the foreground. The more contrast, the brighter the colors, the warmer the colors. That's why I'm putting some yellow there. And then the further away it is, generally you want to create the illusion of depth. So you make the colors less saturated, less contrasty, and also a little bit on the cooler side of the spectrum. So here again, placing some brighter colors, closer to the foreground, blending it in with the road, getting rid of the white on the page. Okay, so this is the end of the first wash. As you can see, all the white's been covered up. I put in the warm and the cool colors. Now I'm going to go back in for the second wash. And in this wash, you add more paint, less water, and start to define some of the details. So I know I want to give a hint of more shadows and shape to the trees in the distance. So a slightly darker mix of ultramarine and burnt sienna gives, again, kind of a cool gray, a little bit more ultramarine there. And that's just to kind of suggest the trees in the background. Again, the goal isn't to paint every single leaf, but to really have the painting me be more descriptive and just suggest things. Okay, so I'm moving a little bit closer to the foreground. Again, moving back from the background to the foreground. Colors are going to get a little bit more intense, a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more warm in tone. So just dabbing in some yellow ochre, a lot more yellow ochre over here. And soon I'll be laying down the trunks and then getting the foliage going. Okay, so this is trunk number 1, and it's a mix of Payne's Gray and burnt sienna. And the brush I'm using actually for most of this painting is going to be this brush. And it's actually a sumi brush, so it's made for kind of sumi painting, and it's pretty simple. It's like goat hair in a bamboo handle. I think the brush itself costs like $3, but it's pretty cool. It allows you to paint in really rough textures, but the goat hair is also really absorbent, so it can soak up lots of water, and you can make nice big washes with it. Here I'm trying to do a little bit of dry brush, have that broken line, kind of suggests the tree trunk and the bark and maybe some light. Here I'm building up kind of the ground that the tree's into. It's going to be in the shadows, so laying down some darker values here. Okay, so with the tree trunks down, I'm putting on the foliage on the trees, and I believe I'm using sap green, hooker's green, and darkening the green with, again, some ultramarine blue. I think I went a little bit too dark on that tree because it pushes it forward. Now I have to compensate by making the trees in the foreground really, really dark. If I were to do it again, I probably would have done that first bit of green a little bit lighter. So now I have to compensate by really punching up the saturation and the thickness of the paint to pull those trees forward. Okay, so moving on to the other side of the road. Here I'm trying to not make the same mistake of making this tree too dark. You can see the tip of the brush. I'm doing what's called a split hair technique. So I took the brush and kind of, as it sounds, split the hairs. This allows for a little bit more irregular brush stroke, kind of suggest individual leaves without painting each one. And that's one really cool thing about this brush, is that it can work a fine point, but you can also roughen it up and give your painting a lot of texture, as opposed to just a typical round brush, which tends to make the same kind of mark. These goat hair brushes are pretty suggestive. It's almost like calligraphy. I mean, I guess that's kind of what like sumi painting actually is, like a painting meets calligraphy. So it makes sense that you can do the same with watercolor. Okay, so now it's time for my favorite part of every painting, and it's to add the shadows. Shadows are what really give a painting life, and communicate depth and give a sense of light. So again, doing a little split hair with the sumi brush. I think the mix is ultramarine and, again, burnt sienna in different proportions. More ultramarine will make it cooler, more burnt sienna will make it warmer. I think as I get closer, I'm trying to add more pigment to the mix of the shadow, and also adding a little bit of red, so it's a little bit more almost purplish. So here, again, suggesting grass in the shade with the split hair. I love that this brush, really, you can work in a rough texture. And I love the expressiveness, how it suggests like dappled light and kind of just breaks up, it just adds a little like sprezzatura to the painting. So here, adding more shadows. One of the big challenges in watercolor is that it's a transparent medium. So it's actually really difficult to get really dark. That's something I definitely still struggle with, especially on different papers. And some papers tend to take a lot more pigment a lot easier. This is not one of those papers. I find it actually really difficult to get a dark value with this notebook. But here again, just laying in the shadows, building it up slowly. This is really the fun part. This is where I feel like the painting gets its depth and comes alive. Everything leads up to this point of adding the shadows and adding the drama. Okay, now it's the final stage. The shadows are set, and I'm actually adding in some highlights. With watercolor, it's it's one of those mediums where once you paint it over, you can't get that lightness back unless you use something like gouache, which is essentially an opaque watercolor. So one of my pans in the palette is just white gouache, and I'll use that to add highlights. You can mix it with other colors. I think I mixed in a little bit of yellow to give the highlights a little bit more warmth. But it is a good way to bring some sparkle back to the painting. For foliage, I like to dab in the highlights in like the darkest part of the trees because it really pops out, builds that contrast, and just really kind of emphasizes that bit of glow from the sunlight. So again, suggesting some blades of grass getting hit with the light, popping from the shadows. I think it really between this just real light addition of highlights and the shadows, that's where the life of the painting really comes in. All right, so I'm done. That is the scene, and that is the painting. Again, not a one-to-one representation, but kind of just a nice way to capture the moment, have my own spin on it, a little bit of an impressionistic style. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know this is completely different from other videos I've done, but some of you have requested a Bob Ross style video, so this is it. Let me know what you guys think if you want to see more of these, and as always, keep the supple side down.